Did you know that Assassin's Creed Black Flag is over 10 years old now? Ubisoft's answer to Pirates of the Caribbean was a real high point for the series, but what is it like to play in 2024? And more specifically, what is it like to play on Steam Deck in 2024? Does it run well on this system, and how does the game hold up? That is what we're going to be answering today. Now, back in October 2013 when this game first came out, I remember seeing a lot of articles about how the PC port wasn't really that well optimized. A lot of people had trouble getting it running smoothly, and in fact I also remember that this was part of the reason why I didn't really play it. So I bought the game about a year later and I just couldn't really get it to run, and I had a pretty good PC at the time as well, so I've been really interested to find out how it runs on the Steam Deck. So I played around with a few different settings, but in the end I decided that I actually like the default settings the best. These are almost but not quite maxed out. At native resolution in handheld, I think that the game looks really nice with these settings. The environments are quite varied, you go from jungle to the beach to the open sea, and so that does tend to mean you can get quite a range of frame rates when playing at these settings. Now, personally, I find variable frame rate pretty annoying, so what I did was I used the Steam Deck options to lock the frame rate to 40 frames per second. And at these settings, it's not really dropped below 40 for the entire time that I've played. When I've been doing recordings though, I've left the frame rate unlocked so you can have a look and see what you think yourself. So you'll notice that there are times when it does actually sit at 60 frames per second for a little while, but then there are also times when it sort of drops all the way down to the low 40s, and this is the reason why I locked it at 40 frames per second. I did try lowering the graphics settings in an attempt to get sort of a stable 50 to 60 frames instead, but even bumping the settings down, a couple of notches towards the low end, it didn't really have a really big impact on the frame rate. And because of the age of the game, as you're sort of getting lower and lower in the graphics settings, I found that I thought it started to look not so great. It was starting to look not too detailed and, a bit blurry, pixely textures. But really, I've been quite happy playing with that locked 40 frames, and if you stick with these settings, then you tend to get about 2.5 to 3 hours of battery life, which I was really pleased with actually. There is a little room to sort of bump up the graphics a little bit more, and at that point you can sort of lock the frame rate to 30 and you can sort of get a stable 30, but I didn't really find that you got such a big noticeable difference in the graphics between that jump of 30 to 40, and I also just think that 40 feels quite a lot better than 30, so that's kind of why I've opted not to do that for most of the time that I've been playing. So that was handheld, but what about playing this game docked? Well, obviously if you stick with the sort of 720p resolution, then you're gonna get the same performance. But playing docked even on a monitor, not on a TV, I did kind of notice that 720p, it felt quite stretched, the resolution felt quite bad. It was kind of pixely and blurry, and that's just on a monitor, so I can't imagine what playing it on like a big TV stretched across that screen would be like. Instead, I think the best option is to leave the graphics to the same settings that you were playing in handheld, and instead bump the resolution up to 1080p, 1920 by 1080. Now, this looks, I think, a lot better. You do sort of lose some of those frames, but you can lock it at 30 and it will stick at 30 for the entire time. If you do leave it unlocked, then it does sort of sometimes get up to the low 40s, but again, I didn't really like the jumping between 30s and low 40s. I much prefer just to lock it at 30. It felt smooth, and we're not talking about a fast-paced first-person shooter or anything like that. 30 frames per second does work pretty well for this game. And I still think that even though this game is over 10 years old now, at 1080p it looks quite nice to play. A couple other things I wanted to mention. So I'm playing on an LCD Steam Deck. I don't have an OLED, so if you do have an OLED, it might be that you can get a few extra frames out of this game. I have heard that it's supposed to run just a tiny bit better for a lot of games now. The fan is also incredibly quiet playing Black Flag. I don't remember it spinning up even one time. That's through all of the different settings, docked and undocked, different resolutions, different graphics settings. I don't remember the fan spinning up a single time, so I think that's a real positive if you're somebody who really hates the sound of the fan spinning up and down. I've also been testing out sleep mode. I really like sleep mode on Steam Deck games. It works fine if you're in the middle of a mission, you don't want to lose your progress, you can put it to sleep easily, but one thing to note is that sometimes when I woke the game back up, I just have a black screen for the game instead. Now, the Steam Deck was running because I could use the menu to open up the Steam menu, but the game screen itself was black. But every time that happened, if I just put it back to sleep and then woke it up again, it seemed to be fine. And as time went on, it seemed to be that only happened when I was playing docked, put it to sleep, and then woke it up undocked. So just keep an eye out if that same thing might happen to you. Finally, like all Ubisoft games these days, it does unfortunately run you through Ubisoft Connect when you play. Now, I've made 2 other videos about playing Assassin's Creed games on the Steam Deck, and one of the top comments that I receive the most is that people really hate Ubisoft Connect. It seems to cause a lot of trouble for people, and sometimes they can't even get the game to run at all. I've never had that. I've always been able to get the game to actually run. But what I did experience with this one was not quite as smooth as with the other games. The first time launch for this game, going through Ubisoft Connect, it took a really long time across all the different stages. I think it was probably about 5 minutes in total, just, it doing the setup, installing the launcher, that kind of thing. It took way longer than I expected, and at points I genuinely thought that it wasn't doing anything. It sort of like got stuck in a loop, and I was considering closing it all down and starting again when it finally moved on to the next step. So yeah, just be warned, because I was tempted to shut it down and start again, but it did eventually work for me. One other thing about Black Flag specifically is that Ubisoft Connect never seems to remember my password. It remembers my login, but I always have to re-enter my password every time I launch the game again. It's not game breaking by any means, but it's just kind of annoying to have to put it in every single time because there's no proper keyboard, so you have to launch the on-screen keyboard with the Steam Deck and type it in that way with a touch screen. And it just didn't happen with the other games. The first time that I entered my username and password was the only time I had to enter it for the other games, for Origins and Odyssey. Every time I launched the game from that point, it would just take me straight through to the game. So I have found this a little bit annoying every time I launch the games, but that's just meant that I've tried to use sleep mode more and not launch the game as often. So that pretty much wraps up the performance section of this video about Assassin's Creed Black Flag on the Steam Deck. I do think this is a really good option to play on the Steam Deck, and I will say I'm having a lot of fun playing it. Since I did my last video like this where I sort of do a deep dive into the performance of a certain game on Steam Deck, I have been trying to make a few others, but those plans sort of fizzled out because the game didn't really keep my attention, but I haven't had a problem with that with Black Flag. This game was part of the Assassin's Creed series before they made the change to the sort of big open world RPG style of games, the first one of those being Origins. And I've actually found it really refreshing to go back to that sort of slightly older style of game, but at the same time it's not so old that you feel like you're making sacrifices and, playing something ancient and clunky. Set in the golden age of piracy, there is a big focus on things like ship traversal and ship combat, and honestly going in, I wasn't really sure how this would sit with me. I didn't know if I would like this style of gameplay, but I've been surprised how much I am actually enjoying it. It does take you a little while to get your own ship, but once you do, the world is yours, sail wherever you want. If, like me, you've played Assassin's Creed Odyssey before you played Black Flag, then I think you'd be familiar with a lot of the ship mechanics, but Black Flag has these additional mechanics to sort of help make the ship gameplay more in depth. You still get into boat combat in the same way, but you've got additional weapons on the front and the back of the ship. You have cannons that you can sort of control from the deck itself, and even the addition of just a rope that lets you swing between ships, or you can even swing off your ship into the sea. That's just a little something that makes the game seem more fun. I also like that you could go around and pillage the seas, preying on all these small, weaker sort of merchant ships, but if you did that too much, then the Armada would send these much bigger, much better equipped ships after you, and you would have to make the choice whether or not to sort of stand your ground or flee on the winds. And even sailing has extra details within that. On the minimap you can see which direction the wind is coming from, which you can use to help boost your speed, and a few missions have you tailing ships whilst also trying to avoid being detected by controls. So there's this balance of going fast to keep up with what it is that you're tailing, but also staying slow enough that you don't get too close to them, whilst at the same time changing direction and adjusting your speed to avoid the other ships and what they can see around them. And it feels great nudging your boat left and right or increasing your speed up and down a couple of notches to avoid being detected. Before this, I didn't really realize that boat stealth was a thing, and I didn't realize how much I would enjoy it, but I am definitely enjoying it. Now, when you do have your feet on solid ground, there's still a lot to enjoy. I did mention that this game is one of the older style Assassin's Creed games, so that means you do lose out on those RPG abilities in the combat, but on the other hand, combat no longer feels like you're sort of just button mashing and waiting for your cooldowns to come back. There's plenty of options to stealth around, assassinate or knock out your target, and there's no longer a threshold for assassinating targets where you need to do so much damage. It just works like it used to. The only slight downside is that this does seem to make combat a little too easy sometimes. I very quickly developed a strategy of just waiting for the opponent to attack, using the counter and kill, and it just seems a little bit overpowered at times. Even when you're surrounded by a lot of enemies, you can feel not so worried, like you know you're probably going to get away. Now, in older games like Black Flag, you can't just scale or climb up every single surface like you can in the later RPGs. So this means that traversal can be a little bit more puzzle-like. As an example of trying to infiltrate somewhere and there's a sniper up on a high point, you can't just run straight at that building and run up it to get to him. You have to make sure you're coming out from the right side and that you've sort of figured out the right path to get up that building. Occasionally, if you're trying to go quickly, it can mean that you end up running up something that can't be climbed properly, so then you sort of have to come back down and you lose out on that speed. But overall, I do like it this way more. It feels really good to sort of race across these rooftops again and figure out the best way to stealthily take out your enemies. Now, this game centers around Edward Kenway, who ventures out onto the seas looking for his fortunes. And I was really surprised when the start of the game has you meeting up with Templars, but eventually you do get your own ship and pirate crew to scourge the seas with. Of all the Assassin's Creed games that I've played, this is probably the one that I found the modern day sections most interesting. There's not been too many of these moments so far, but you're working for Abstergo, you're going through Edward Kenway's past, and you're trying to find cool moments in his life to turn into a movie. Well, at least that's how it starts anyway. Even though I have been enjoying this more than in other games, I do still of course prefer to get back into the ancestors' shoes and run around these sections in the past. The game's pretty funny as well. It's made me laugh quite a few times, and obviously if you're looking for something to sort of scratch a pirate-themed itch, then you can't really go wrong with this one. There's not too many games out there that are sort of doing pirates these days. Obviously you've got Sea of Thieves, and at the time of recording, Skull and Bones isn't quite out, but maybe by the time you're watching this, we will know how good Skull and Bones is. So there we have it. That is Assassin's Creed Black Flag on Steam Deck in 2024. If you've been considering playing this game or picking it up and wondering how it runs on Steam Deck, I really hope you found this video useful. It didn't run quite as well as I expected it to for a 13-year-old game, but you know, we did sort of know already that the port wasn't the best optimized, and really I do think it runs well enough that you can have a great time with this game. So how about you? Are you thinking about picking this up, or maybe you're already having fun playing it on Steam Deck? Let me know what you think of this game down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.